Casey was 68 when the first signs crept in quietly, almost politely, as if not to cause alarm. He'd stop halfway to catch his breath, chalking it up to age or maybe the heat. Then came the swelling in his ankles. It wasn't dramatic, but it lingered. One morning, sitting on the edge of the bed, he felt an unfamiliar heaviness in his chest. Not pain, but a pressure that whispered something wasn't right. It was his daughter, Emily, who finally convinced him to see a doctor. She sat in the waiting room, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, while Casey went through the usual tests. When the doctor returned with the results, his voice softened, that careful tone people use when they're about to say something you don't want to hear. "Casey, your kidneys aren't working the way they should," he said, sliding a paper across the desk. "You've already lost more function than we'd like to see. The good news is there's still time to slow this down, maybe even turn some of it around." Casey nodded, but inside, his thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind. Kidneys? He'd barely thought about them his whole life. That night, he couldn't sleep. The words kept replaying, "Still time." He thought about how many years he might have left and what they would look like if his health kept slipping. He remembered his own father, tired and pale in the last years, and how helpless it had felt to watch. Casey wasn't ready for that, not yet. So he began searching, reading late into the night, his glasses slipping down his nose as article after article popped up on his screen. He found stories of people who'd changed their eating habits and seen their lab numbers improve, of small shifts that added up to something bigger. The next morning, he stood in his kitchen and really looked at the food around him. The bread on the counter, the jar of pickles in the fridge, the soda cans lined up neatly on the shelf. They all felt different now, like strangers. He thought about the doctor's words, about Emily's worried face, and decided this was the day it had to change. Not tomorrow, not next week, today. He started with the simplest thing, adding something good before taking something away. A bowl of blueberries went onto the table, their deep color catching the morning light. When I tell you this story, I think of so many people I've met over the years, patients, friends, even family, who don't realize how much power they have until life presses them into a corner. Casey's journey wasn't about a miracle cure, it was about listening to that quiet warning, making small, deliberate choices, and giving his body a little more kindness than before. Over the weeks that followed, he began to notice changes, not dramatic, but real. The swelling eased, his energy crept back in, and perhaps most importantly, there was a new calm in his eyes, the kind that comes when you stop waiting for the worst and start building the better. Casey hadn't realized how many years he'd been starting lunch with the same sharp fizz. The sound of a soda can opening was almost part of the day's rhythm, like turning on the kitchen light or checking the mailbox. It was comforting, bubbly sweetness after mowing the lawn, a cold sip on a warm afternoon. But after that doctor's visit, every can in his fridge seemed to glare back at him. He remembered the quiet, almost regretful tone in the doctor's voice when he'd mentioned that sugar and phosphoric acid could wear the kidneys down faster, especially now. It wasn't an order, more like a gentle nudge, but it stuck with him. That first week, Casey didn't stop all at once. The cans were still there, lined up in their neat little row, and old habits don't dissolve overnight. But he started replacing one here and there with a glass of cold water, sometimes with a squeeze of lemon just to make it feel less plain. The taste didn't give him that rush of sweetness, but the thought that it might give him a little more time, more mornings in his own bed, more evenings on the porch with Emily, made it easier to swallow. At dinner, he'd pour his water into the same tall glass he used for soda, like fooling himself into a smoother transition. Emily noticed before he even told her. "You've got water instead of your usual," she said one night, glancing at his glass as they ate. Casey shrugged, not wanting to make it a big declaration. "Figured I'd give it a try," he murmured, but she smiled in that way daughters do when they catch their fathers doing something quietly brave. It wasn't about the drink, it was about the choice, the proof that he was willing to push against decades of habit. By the end of that month, the soda was gone from the fridge. The first grocery run without picking up a case felt strange, almost bare, like forgetting your wallet. But there was also a lightness to it, as if the kitchen itself approved. One small change didn't fix his kidneys overnight, but it was the first deliberate step in a long walk back toward health. And in that quiet moment, Casey realized something important. Sometimes the biggest repair work starts not with a new addition, but with letting something go. It was a Saturday when Casey first saw the bowl sitting on his kitchen counter. Emily had been by the night before, dropping off a few groceries, just because, and there it was, a small glass bowl heaped with blueberries so dark they were almost black. A thin sheen of morning light caught their skin, making them look like tiny marbles, polished smooth. Casey wasn't much for fruit unless it came in a pie, but something about the simplicity of it drew him in. He remembered the doctor mentioning antioxidants and protective compounds in passing, words he didn't fully understand but knew were meant to keep trouble at bay. He picked one up between his fingers, rolling it like a coin before popping it into his mouth. The burst was sharper than he expected, tart first, then a mellow sweetness. It didn't taste like medicine, it tasted alive. He poured some into a small cereal bowl, sat at the table, and ate them slowly, one by one, as if each deserved its own moment. There was no grand revelation, no lightning bolt, but a quiet thought settled in. This was something his body wouldn't have to fight against. Over the next week, the blueberries became a morning ritual. He'd rinse a handful, set them beside his oatmeal, or stir them into plain yogurt. Sometimes he'd just eat them alone while looking out the window at the street, waking up. Emily called it blue power one morning when she stopped by and saw him eating them. He chuckled at the phrase, but he liked the way it sounded, like he was arming himself, berry by berry, against something he couldn't quite see. One afternoon, his neighbor Tom wandered over while Casey was tending to the small garden by the porch. "You're looking good, Case," Tom said. "More energy than last month?" Casey shrugged, not wanting to make too much of it, but inside he wondered if it was just coincidence or if these small, consistent choices were starting to add up. It wasn't about pretending blueberries could do magic. It was about building days, healthy, steady, ordinary days that stacked into something stronger. By the end of the month, that glass bowl had a permanent place on the counter, always full, always waiting. And each morning, as Casey reached for it, he felt a little steadier. It wasn't just food anymore, it was a promise to himself, one he was finally keeping. It happened on a Thursday evening, the kind of night when the sky holds onto its last light a little longer, casting a soft gold through the kitchen window. Casey stood at the counter, slicing vegetables for a simple stir-fry when he reached for the small white bulb tucked behind the salt shaker. Garlic had always been there, a background player in his meals, but that night he looked at it differently. He remembered the doctor's offhand comment about natural protectors and how certain foods could ease the strain on kidneys. He didn't recall all the science, but he remembered one word clearly: garlic. He set a clove on the cutting board and pressed down with the flat of his knife. The skin loosened under his fingers, releasing that sharp, almost fiery scent. As he chopped, the smell filled the room, curling into the corners like it had a will of its own. It brought him back to childhood dinners when his mother would sauté garlic before adding anything else to the pan, saying it was how you wake up the flavor. Casey smiled at the thought, realizing maybe it wasn't just the flavor waking up, it was him. That night, he tossed the minced garlic into the pan near the end of cooking, just like he'd read was best for keeping its goodness intact. The sizzle was quick, the aroma blooming instantly. When Emily stopped by later to return a book, she noticed it right away. "Smells amazing in here," she said, peeking into the kitchen. Casey offered her a plate, and they ate together at the small table, the garlic weaving its way through each bite without overpowering. Over the next few weeks, garlic began showing up more often in his meals, not just in stir-fries, but in salad dressings, roasted with vegetables, even rubbed raw onto warm toast with a drizzle of olive oil. It became a quiet sort of companion, something small and humble that still managed to make a difference. Casey liked that about it. One afternoon, while reading in his armchair, he thought about how these changes, first the soda, then the blueberries, now the garlic, weren't just about avoiding illness. They were about claiming a kind of control, one meal at a time. The choices were stacking up, forming a path that felt both new and familiar, like walking an old road in better shoes. And as he washed the cutting board that night, the scent of garlic lingering on his hands, Casey felt, without quite saying it, that maybe he was building more than a diet, maybe he was building time. It was raining that afternoon, the kind of slow, steady drizzle that made the grocery store feel warmer than usual. Casey pushed his cart past the usual aisles, not really in a hurry. He was scanning for the things he'd begun to trust: blueberries, garlic, a good loaf of bread, when his eyes caught the green-white curve of a cabbage stacked high in the produce section. For years, he'd thought of cabbage as filler food, something thrown into soups when nothing else was around or served in coleslaw at summer barbecues. But something made him pause. He remembered the doctor mentioning it once, how it was low in potassium and good for kidneys, especially for people watching their numbers. He picked one up, feeling the weight in his hands. It was heavier than it looked, its leaves packed tight like secrets. Back home, he set it on the counter and stared at it, wondering what to do. Emily called just then, and when he mentioned his cabbage curiosity, she laughed. "You know, Dad, Grandma used to make braised cabbage with onions when we were little. Cheap, easy, and she swore it kept her healthy." That was enough for Casey. He found himself slicing the cabbage into ribbons, letting the knife find its rhythm, and tossing it into a pan with a little olive oil and, of course, garlic. The scent that rose was nothing like the boiled cabbage of his memories. It was sweet and earthy, the kind of smell that wrapped itself around the room. Casey took his first bite straight from the pan, surprised by the tenderness and how it held the flavor. It wasn't flashy, but it was honest, and he liked that. Over the next week, he tried it in salads, in a quick stir-fry, even chopped fine into soup. Red cabbage made an appearance too, its deep color looking almost royal on the plate. When Tom stopped by one evening to borrow a wrench, Casey offered him a side of the warm cabbage dish he'd just finished. Tom ate quietly, then looked at him with a grin. "Never thought I'd say this, but this is good." Casey chuckled, a little proud. More than taste, though, the cabbage brought something else, a reminder that health didn't have to be complicated or expensive. It could grow from the simplest things, overlooked until you saw them for what they were. And as Casey rinsed the pan, the rain still whispering against the windows, he realized this wasn't just about adding foods to his plate. It was about letting small, humble choices make a big, quiet difference. It was during one of his slower afternoons that Casey found himself wandering into the little Italian deli at the edge of town. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, maybe some bread, maybe just an excuse to be out of the house. The shelves were lined with pastas, tins of tomatoes, and jars of olives, but it was the row of tall, green-tinted bottles that caught his eye. The sunlight from the front window glinted off the glass, making the liquid inside glow like gold. Extra virgin olive oil, the label read in looping script. He'd used the cheap stuff before, but this looked different. It felt like something you poured with intention. He remembered reading in one of those late-night articles about how olive oil could calm inflammation and even protect the body's small, delicate vessels, like the ones in the kidneys, from strain. It wasn't about miracle cures, it was about giving his body the gentlest kind of support. Casey picked up a bottle, heavier than he expected, and carried it to the counter as if he were holding something rare. That night, he kept the meal simple. Slices of fresh bread, a small dish of olive oil with a pinch of salt and cracked pepper. He tore the bread, dipped it, and tasted something smooth, almost grassy, with a warmth that lingered. It didn't shout the way butter did, it whispered. And in that quiet, he realized he liked the way it made him slow down. Meals became less about filling up and more about paying attention, to the flavors, to his body, to the act of nourishing himself. Olive oil began showing up in other corners of his kitchen. A drizzle over steamed vegetables, a swirl into soup, a soft sheen over roasted fish. Emily noticed one Sunday lunch. "You've been cooking differently," she said, tilting her fork toward the salad glistening under the light. Casey smiled, figured I'd try something that might stick around longer than a diet. She didn't press for details, but her eyes softened in that way that told him she understood. Weeks later, while cleaning the counter, he caught sight of that same green glass bottle, now half empty, and thought about how it had become part of his rhythm. There was a steadiness in choosing something that was good for him, not because he was told to, but because it made life taste better. And maybe, he thought as he capped the bottle, that was the secret, letting small pleasures do the hard work quietly, drop by, golden drop. The pineapple sat in the corner of the produce display like it had been waiting for him. Casey rarely bought tropical fruit. It always felt too sweet, too fancy for his small, practical kitchen. He'd pass them by, choosing apples or oranges instead, the safe bets. But that day, as he reached for a bag of spinach, the scent of pineapple drifted faintly through the air, warm and inviting. He remembered reading about it somewhere, how it was gentler on potassium levels than other tropical fruits, and how something inside, an enzyme called bromelain, might help ease inflammation. It was the kind of detail he might have dismissed in the past, but now it felt like an invitation. He picked one up, its rough skin prickling against his palm. Back home, the work began, twisting off the spiky crown, slicing away the thick rind, cutting it into golden cubes that glistened under the kitchen light. The first bite was bright and sweet, with just enough acidity to wake him up. It reminded him of summer picnics when he was younger, when the world felt bigger and his body moved without thought. He set a bowl of it in the fridge, thinking it might make an easy snack over the next few days. Emily stopped by later that week and caught him with a fork in hand, leaning against the counter, eating the chilled pineapple straight from the bowl. "That's new," she said, raising an eyebrow. Casey chuckled. "Figured I'd change the scenery on my plate." She grinned, snagged a piece, and nodded in approval. There was something quietly satisfying in sharing that small shift without making it a big declaration. Soon, pineapple became a regular guest at his table, tossed into a fruit salad, tucked into a stir-fry, even grilled on the porch for a hint of caramel sweetness. It didn't feel like health food in the strict sense. It felt like something to look forward to. And that, Casey thought, was maybe the most important part of all this. Not just what these changes were doing for his kidneys, but how they were giving him moments of joy again. One evening, as he washed the last of the pineapple juice from his hands, he realized these choices weren't just about avoiding the worst. They were about making the days he still had taste better, feel lighter. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about what his body had lost. He was thinking about what it could still enjoy. It started with a chill in the air, the kind that made Casey crave something warm and slow-cooked. He pulled out a pot, thinking about making his mother's old vegetable soup. The onions were sitting in their usual basket by the pantry door. Plain, familiar, nothing special. He'd bought them out of habit, never giving them the kind of thought he now gave blueberries or olive oil. But that day, he remembered reading how onions carried quercetin, a compound that could help protect the body's blood vessels and even ease some of the strain on kidneys. It wasn't a cure, just another gentle nudge in the right direction. He set one on the cutting board and began slicing. The smell rose instantly, sharp enough to bring a sting to his eyes. As the pieces hit the pot and softened in the heat, they transformed, losing their bite, turning sweet, filling the kitchen with the scent of something comforting. He added carrots, celery, cabbage from last week's discovery, and let it all simmer. By the time Emily dropped by to return a borrowed dish, the air in the house felt like a warm embrace. They sat at the table, steaming bowls in front of them, and ate slowly. Emily blew on her spoon and said, "This tastes like home." Casey smiled, feeling a quiet pride in the way a few simple onions could set the tone for the whole meal. He told her in passing about the quercetin, and she nodded as if to say, "I'm glad you're paying attention now." Over the following weeks, onions became less of a background ingredient and more of a constant. Raw in salads for a bit of sharpness, roasted until sweet and sticky, even pickled to add brightness to sandwiches. They were cheap, easy, and always ready to do their part. Casey liked that about them. They didn't demand attention, yet they made everything better. One evening, as he sat on the porch with a mug of tea, he thought about how the onions were a lot like the changes he'd been making. Not dramatic, not flashy, but steady. The kind of steady that adds up over time until one day you realize you've built something worth keeping. It was a crisp afternoon when Casey found himself walking the path behind the park, the one that wound past the old oak trees and the creek where he used to fish as a boy. In his jacket pocket, his hand brushed against the smooth curve of an apple he'd tucked there before leaving the house. He hadn't planned it, just grabbed it on the way out, the way his father used to when they worked in the yard together. Back then, an apple was a quick snack, nothing more. But now, as the skin caught the autumn light and he bit into it, he thought about the way the doctor had explained the role of fiber and antioxidants, how even small things could make a real difference. The first bite was crisp and cold, the sweetness mingling with the faint tang near the skin. Juice ran down his fingers, and for a moment it wasn't about kidneys or numbers on a chart, it was just about that taste, that crunch, that reminder of being younger. He walked slowly, savoring each bite, feeling the rhythm of his steps match the rhythm of his chewing. It wasn't a grand change, just another quiet choice that left him feeling a little lighter. That evening, he sliced another apple and set it on the table while Emily visited. She reached for a piece without thinking, and they ate together, talking about nothing in particular. "Funny," she said, "how you always used to skip the fruit bowl, and now you're the one keeping it full." Casey smiled but didn't explain. Some things didn't need explaining, they just became part of who you were. Soon, apples became more than a snack. He'd slice them into his morning oatmeal, pair them with a handful of walnuts in the afternoon, even bake them into a simple dessert on Sundays. Each time he felt that same small satisfaction, like keeping a promise to himself. The changes he'd made so far weren't about chasing perfection, they were about making the everyday a little kinder to his body. And as he set the core aside and wiped his hands, Casey thought about how, for the first time in years, the days ahead felt more open. Not because he expected to undo every bit of damage, but because he was finally giving himself a chance. One bite, one habit, one quiet apple at a time. It was the bacon that made him pause. Saturday mornings had always carried that familiar scent, salty, smoky, curling through the house like a memory. Casey stood at the stove, skillet in hand, staring at the thin strips waiting to be cooked. He could almost hear Emily's voice from a few weeks back, gentle but firm, reminding him of what the doctor had said about processed meats. He knew the words by now. Too much salt, too many additives, hard on the kidneys. But knowing was different from feeling, and in that moment, he felt the pull of years of routine. He set the skillet down and stepped back. There was no drama to it, no sudden burst of resolve, just a quiet recognition that this was one of those crossroads moments. He thought about all the mornings ahead and how choosing differently today could mean more of them. Instead, he cracked a couple of eggs into the pan, letting them sizzle slowly in a drizzle of olive oil. It wasn't the same, but the smell was warm and the choice sat lighter on his chest. Later that week, he began going through his pantry with new eyes. The salty snacks, the cans of soup with sodium levels printed in bold, even the sodas he'd once kept just for guests, they all carried the same weight now. One by one, he passed them along to a neighbor, keeping only what felt like a step forward. It wasn't about stripping his kitchen bare, it was about reshaping it into a place that didn't work against him. Emily noticed the changes the next time she visited. "Your shelves look different," she said, running her hand over the jars of beans, the fresh produce in the fridge. "Feels different too," Casey replied. And it was true, there was a kind of quiet in the kitchen now, not the absence of comfort, but the space to build new ones. In the evenings, he sometimes missed those old flavors, but the missing was softer than he expected. It was like giving up an old chair that had grown too wobbly to sit in. You remember the comfort, but you know you're safer without it. And as Casey rinsed his plate, he realized that letting go wasn't about loss. It was about making room for something better to take root. It was a sunny afternoon when Casey caught himself doing something he hadn't expected, standing over the counter, eating blueberries straight from the bowl without a second thought. They'd become his favorite, a habit he was proud of, but by the time he looked down, half the bowl was gone. He laughed at first, thinking it was harmless. Then he remembered something the doctor had said during his last visit. Even good foods in excess can create new problems. It wasn't a warning meant to scare him, just a reminder that balance was as important as the choice itself. That evening, Casey poured a smaller portion into a dish, savoring them slowly instead of by the handful. The difference wasn't in the taste, it was in the pace. He noticed how the flavor lingered more, how each bite felt like part of a conversation rather than a rush. It made him think about other parts of his life, the times he'd tried to make progress by pushing too hard, only to burn out. Maybe health wasn't about cramming in as much good as possible, but letting the right amount do its quiet work. Emily came by for dinner and noticed the neatly portioned fruit on the table. "Trying something new?" she asked. Casey smiled. Trying not to overdo the good stuff, she laughed, but he could see in her eyes that she understood. This was another shift, one that might not be as visible as giving up soda or bacon, but just as important. In the weeks that followed, Casey applied that same thought to other parts of his diet. Olive oil still drizzled over his salads, but with a lighter hand. Pineapple still brightened his afternoons, but in a small bowl instead of a heap. Even the garlic and onions, as beloved as they'd become, found their balance on the plate. And strangely, he found more joy in them this way, like each was a guest who'd been invited to stay just long enough to be appreciated. One night, as he rinsed a small, empty dish in the sink, Casey realized this was what he'd been moving toward all along. Not a strict plan or a list of rules, but a steady rhythm he could live with. It felt less like a diet and more like a friendship with his own body, one built on trust, patience, and the understanding that sometimes just enough is exactly right. When Casey first sat in the doctor's office months ago, the words, "You've already lost more function than we'd like to see," felt like a heavy door swinging shut. He didn't know then that the real story wouldn't be about loss at all. It would be about rebuilding, one small, deliberate choice at a time. Giving up the soda cans that had been part of his afternoons for decades was the first quiet victory. Adding blueberries, garlic, cabbage, and other kidney-friendly foods wasn't just about nutrition. It was about letting his kitchen become a place of care instead of quiet harm. Over time, the changes began to weave together, not in loud, dramatic ways, but in moments. A bowl of pineapple shared with Emily, the smell of onions softening in a pot of soup, the slow pour of olive oil over fresh vegetables. Each one was a reminder that health is built in the daily rhythm, not the grand gesture. Even learning moderation, treating the good things with the same respect as the bad, gave him a steadiness he hadn't expected. If you see yourself in Casey's story, if you've been waiting for the perfect time to start, it doesn't have to be tomorrow or next week. It can be now, with something small. Swap one thing, add one thing, choose one thing that feels kinder to your body. You don't need to do it all at once. You just need to start. Because in the end, the real transformation isn't just in the kidneys or the numbers on a chart, it's in the way you feel when you wake up, knowing you've given yourself the gift of another day lived well. And maybe that's the most hopeful truth of all. It's never too late to turn toward the better.